In a land cradled by the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, where the sun's golden rays kissed the fertile plains, a miracle was unfolding. The air was filled with the sounds of human hands shaping history, the hum of craftsmen, the cries of merchants bartering wares, and the distant chants of priests and towering ziggurats. This was Mesopotamia, the birthplace of human civilization, where humanity's first cities rose like islands from the earth. Sumer stood at the heart of it all, a network of city-states bound by shared gods and rival ambitions. In the city of Uruk, life pulsed with an energy that seemed otherworldly. It wasn't just the clay bricks that built the massive walls of the city, but the sheer will of its people. Farmers dug canals with their bare hands, coaxing the rivers to feed their crops. Merchants carried lapis lazuli and cedarwood, their treasures glinting under the sun, while scribes bent over tablets of wet clay, leaving marks that were far more than lines and shapes. These marks spoke, carried meaning, and told stories. It was the invention of writing, and it began simply enough, symbols to keep track of grain and sheep, the lifeblood of the people. But soon, these marks became words, and words became power. In the quiet of a scribe's chamber, where the smell of damp clay lingered, a new kind of magic was being born. For the first time, humanity could record its thoughts, its laws, and its dreams. Across the plains, Akkad rose like a storm on the horizon. Its leader, Sargon, was not born into power. Legends whispered of a child abandoned on the river, saved by fate, and destined to carve his name into history. With iron will and an army that stretched as far as the eye could see, Sargon united the lands, forging an empire unlike any seen before. His rule brought both order and fear. Villages that once lived quietly under the stars now trembled at the approach of Akkadian banners. Yet, with his empire came roads and trade, connecting people in ways they had never imagined. In Babylon, where the waters of the Euphrates curled protectively around its walls, a new chapter was being written. Here, King Hammurabi stood as a figure larger than life. His name echoed in the streets and homes of his kingdom, carried by a promise that no one was too small to be heard. He gathered his people beneath the grand gates of the city, his voice steady and commanding as he spoke of laws that would bind them all. The Code of Hammurabi was not merely words etched into stone, it was justice carved into the soul of a people. For the farmer wronged by his neighbor, for the merchant cheated in the market, for the slave who sought fairness, there was a voice now, a protector. An eye for an eye, it declared, and though harsh to modern ears, it was a revelation to those who lived under its shadow. It promised structure, fairness, and a future. Yet, life was never simple in these cities. In the bustling markets of Babylon, beneath the shouts of traders and the laughter of children, there was a tension. The rivers that brought life could just as easily bring death with floods that swept away homes and dreams. The gods were unpredictable, their favor as fickle as the wind. In moments of joy and prosperity, they seemed close, like warm sunlight on the skin. In times of famine and war, their absence felt like an open wound. The people endured, their resilience unmatched. They built ziggurats that clawed at the sky, temples that dared to bridge the gap between man and God. They sang songs of Gilgamesh, a king who sought immortality and found instead the bittersweet truth of being human. They worked, they fought, and they loved, leaving behind more than cities of brick and stone. Even now, the clay tablets whisper their stories, stories of a people who dared to defy the chaos of the natural world. Mesopotamia's heartbeat echoes across time, a reminder of where it all began, a place where humanity first learned not just to survive, but to create. The Nile flowed silently under a sky painted in shades of fire as the sun descended behind the dunes. In its embrace, Egypt thrived, a land of gods and kings, its borders etched with the promise of power and mystery. Towering obelisks reached for the heavens, their surfaces glinting with inscriptions that sang praises to rulers who claimed divine favor. But Egypt's story was never confined within its golden sands. Beyond the desert stretched a world teeming with traders, warriors, and dreamers who would meet the great dynasties in both friendship and conflict. The pharaohs of Egypt, each a living god, carried more than the weight of crowns, they bore the destiny of a nation. In the days of the Old Kingdom, pyramids pierced the skies, eternal homes for rulers who believed death was not an end but a passage. To build such wonders required more than labor and devotion. It demanded connections far beyond Egypt's borders. From the east, traders brought lapis lazuli, its deep blue richer than the Nile's twilight reflections. Cedarwood from Lebanon arrived to shape grand ships and palaces. With every transaction, Egypt's heart beat a little stronger, its influence reaching deeper into the Middle East. But not every meeting was peaceful. As the Middle Kingdom rose, Egypt's gaze turned outward, seeking to protect its prosperity and expand its borders. The Hyksos came like shadows on the wind, crossing into the delta with chariots that thundered across the sands. These invaders brought new weapons, new tactics, and a lesson that Egypt would never forget: survival required strength and adaptation. And adapt they did. When the Hyksos were finally driven out, Egypt emerged fiercer, wiser, and ready to reclaim its place among the world's powers. The New Kingdom was a time of expansion and ambition, where pharaohs like Thutmose III led armies beyond their homeland. The sands of the Sinai and the lands of Canaan bore witness to the clash of steel and the cries of soldiers. Under the leadership of these warrior kings, Egypt pushed into the Levant, establishing its presence in a region that connected continents and cultures. Cities that once stood independent now paid tribute, their wealth swelling the coffers of the Nile's rulers. In the palaces of Egypt, the spoils of these ventures gleamed. Gold from Nubia, pottery from Mesopotamia, and art from distant lands adorned the halls. But it wasn't just goods that crossed these borders, it was ideas. Egyptian gods found homes in foreign lands, their stories whispered in temples far from the Nile. At the same time, the beliefs and traditions of other cultures left their mark on Egypt. The gods of Canaan, the myths of Mesopotamia, they mingled with Egypt's own legends, creating a tapestry as vibrant as the painted walls of their tombs. Yet, the bonds forged through trade and war were fragile. In the later years of the New Kingdom, the Hittites rose to power, their armies meeting Egypt's in battles that shook the very ground. At Kadesh, chariots charged and clashed in a symphony of chaos as the forces of Ramses II fought to defend Egypt's dominion. The outcome was no clear victory, but what followed was perhaps more remarkable than the battle itself: a peace treaty. Written in cuneiform and hieroglyphs, it marked one of history's first recorded agreements between great powers. Egypt and the Hittites, once fierce rivals, now bound themselves to coexist. Through it all, the Middle East remained both Egypt's mirror and its challenge. Across the deserts, life thrived in ways that mirrored the Nile's prosperity but carried their own unique rhythms. From the bustling markets of Byblos to the ancient streets of Ur, these civilizations traded with Egypt not just goods, but a shared understanding of ambition and survival. The sands carried whispers of stories that bridged these lands, stories of alliances, betrayals, and friendships that transcended borders. In the quiet corners of temples and the bustling chaos of ports, people from different worlds met. A trader from Babylon might find himself standing before the towering gates of Thebes, marveling at the grandeur of a land both familiar and strange. Egypt was never an island. Its greatness was built on its ability to reach out, to take what was offered, and to give in return. For every warrior who marched eastward and every ship that carried goods from foreign shores, there was a connection made, a thread woven into the larger fabric of history. The rivers, the sands, and the mountains bore witness to a story that was never just Egypt's alone, but one that belonged to all who touched its shores. The ground trembled under the march of soldiers, their shadows stretching long under the fading light of day. At the heart of this army stood the kings of Assyria, their gaze as sharp as the iron swords that glinted in their hands. These were men who believed their right to rule was written in the stars, that the gods had chosen them to spread order through conquest. From the towering walls of Nineveh to the distant edges of the known world, their ambition was unyielding, their resolve unbreakable. The Assyrian Empire did not rise gently, it burst into history like a thunderclap. City after city fell beneath their might. The sound of battering rams echoed through valleys, and the screams of the conquered filled the air. It wasn't enough to win, Assyria demanded absolute submission. Cities that resisted were turned to ash, their ruins left as warnings to others who might dare stand against them. The people of the land came to know the Assyrians as both bringers of terror and masters of innovation. They built roads to connect their empire, facilitating trade and the swift movement of armies. Their libraries housed knowledge stolen from the corners of the earth, treasures of thought collected in defiance of destruction. But Assyria's rise was not without challenge. Beyond the Euphrates, another power had grown bold. The Hittites, with their armies of bronze and their gods of storm and sun, once reigned as the rulers of Anatolia. Their kings were as ambitious as those of Assyria, their chariots as swift, their resolve as fierce. At the height of their dominance, the Hittites stood toe-to-toe with the great powers of their age, clashing with Egypt in battles that left the sands soaked in blood. In the city of Hattusa, carved into the rugged hills, they crafted treaties with the Egyptians and ruled their domain with a sense of both pride and pragmatism. For a time, the Hittites flourished. Their kingdom stretched far, its veins pulsing with trade and culture. In the quiet halls of their temples, priests whispered prayers to gods whose wrath could shatter mountains. The people of Anatolia lived in a balance forged by strength. But as the seasons turned, cracks began to form. Famine swept through the lands, and internal rivalries grew sharp as daggers. Enemies pressed from the edges, testing the resolve of a kingdom that once seemed unshakable. The collapse of the Hittites was not a sudden storm, but a slow unraveling. The Sea Peoples, with their mysterious origins and relentless hunger for conquest, swept across the Mediterranean. Their ships darkened the waters, their blades ending the reign of kings who had once thought themselves eternal. Hattusa fell, its palaces burned, its walls crumbled into silence. The once mighty Hittites vanished from the stage, leaving only whispers and ruins behind. Yet, as one empire fell, another expanded. The Assyrians watched and learned. They understood that power was not merely in holding land, but in controlling hearts and minds. They mastered fear, wielding it as a weapon as sharp as their swords. Reliefs carved into their palace walls showed the triumphs of their armies, captives marched in chains, cities burned, and kings knelt in submission. But these carvings were more than art, they were messages to all who might resist. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, Assyria reached its zenith. Their armies were disciplined, their cities fortified, their leaders ruthless. Beyond the walls of Nineveh, the empire stretched like a shadow, covering lands once ruled by others. But even at their height, the Assyrians knew that power could slip through their fingers like sand. Their laws were harsh, their punishments severe, and their rule unrelenting, all designed to hold together a realm forged in fire and blood. The story of the Hittites and the Assyrians is not one of simple victories and defeats. It is a tale of ambition that refused to bow, of civilizations that dared to rise even as the odds pressed against them. From the ruins of Hattusa to the towering gates of Nineveh, their legacies remain, etched into the stones and whispered through the ages, a reminder of empires that burned brightly, leaving behind a light that never fades. The air was thick with the sound of footsteps, thousands of them, steady and determined, marching across vast plains under a sun that seemed to bow in reverence. At the head of this procession rode a man whose name would echo through eternity, Cyrus. Not as a conqueror who crushed and burned, but as a unifier whose vision reached far beyond bloodshed. To the peoples of Mesopotamia, his arrival wasn't marked by fear, it was marked by hope. They whispered his name with cautious reverence, waiting to see if the stories of his fairness would prove true. Cyrus the Great wasn't just a king. He was the architect of an empire that stretched across lands so diverse, it seemed impossible to unite them. From the mountains of Persia to the fertile crescent of Babylon, he created something the world had never seen, a realm where people of all tongues and gods could live without fear of oppression. When his armies reached Babylon, it wasn't a battle that greeted them. The gates were opened, the city surrendering without a fight. The people stood in silence, their hearts caught between fear and awe as Cyrus entered, not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. His first act was one of mercy, not might. He freed the Jews, exiled from their homeland, and allowed them to return to Jerusalem. It wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a declaration that his rule would be different. Where others demanded submission through terror, Cyrus ruled with understanding. The Cyrus cylinder, etched with declarations of tolerance and fairness, stood as a testament to his ideals. The empire he created was vast, but it was held together not just by armies and laws, but by respect, a fragile, precious thread that bound the hearts of many. As the Achaemenid Empire flourished under Cyrus and his successors, its administration became a marvel. The empire was divided into satrapies, each ruled by a governor who ensured order while allowing local traditions to thrive. Roads like the Royal Road spanned the empire, connecting cities and allowing messages to travel faster than ever before. It was as if the land itself had veins, pumping the lifeblood of trade, culture, and communication across regions that had once been isolated from one another. But the empire wasn't just held together by governance. At its heart was a faith that spoke of order and chaos, of light and darkness. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the Persian kings, wasn't just a set of rituals. It was a philosophy that guided their rule. Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom and light, stood as a beacon of righteousness. The fire that burned in Zoroastrian temples wasn't just a symbol, it was a reminder that truth and justice should guide every action. Cyrus believed in these principles, and they shaped the empire he built. Yet, even as the empire reached heights of prosperity, shadows loomed on the horizon. Darius I, the king who carried on Cyrus's legacy, turned his eyes westward. Across the Aegean Sea lay Greece, a collection of city-states fiercely independent and proud. To the Persians, Greece seemed insignificant, a mere cluster of rocky lands compared to their vast empire. But it was here, on these rocky shores, that one of history's most dramatic clashes would unfold. The Greco-Persian Wars began with ambition but soon turned into a test of will. At Marathon, Persian forces landed with the confidence of an empire that had never known true defeat. But the Greeks, united against a common enemy, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The fields of Marathon bore witness to the cries of battle, the clash of shields, and the unyielding resistance of men who refused to bow. The Persians, for all their might, were pushed back, their retreat marking a rare moment of defeat. The empire wasn't finished. Under Xerxes, the son of Darius, the Persians returned with an army so vast it seemed endless. The bridges they built across the Hellespont stood as a symbol of their determination to conquer. Yet, even as their forces swept into Greece, resistance awaited them. At Thermopylae, a narrow pass became a stage for heroism as a small band of Spartans stood against the might of Persia. Though they fell, their sacrifice inspired the Greek city-states to fight on. The battles that followed, Salamis, Plataea, were moments where courage clashed with power, where the underdog refused to submit. The Persian Empire, though vast and magnificent, could not subdue the spirit of the Greeks. Yet, even in defeat, Persia remained a beacon of innovation and culture. The wars, though brutal, became a bridge between East and West, a collision of worlds that left both changed forever. The Achaemenid Empire was more than just its battles and rulers. It was a place where ideas flowed as freely as goods, where cultures met and mingled in ways that shaped the future. From the inscriptions left on palace walls to the ruins of Persepolis, its legacy endures, a story of vision, unity, and the unyielding desire to build something greater than oneself. The wind carried whispers of change across the sands of the Middle East, a change that marched with unrelenting footsteps and gleamed under the banner of a young king. He was only 20 when he ascended the throne, but his gaze was that of a man who saw beyond the horizon. Alexander of Macedon, with his restless ambition and unparalleled genius, stood poised to challenge an empire that had ruled for centuries. His name struck both awe and fear, not because of what he had already done, but because of what he would not stop doing. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, had long been a titan among nations. Its cities gleamed with riches, its people lived under laws that had stood for generations. But to Alexander, the son of Philip, it was not an impenetrable force, it was a prize. He did not come to Persia to negotiate or pay homage. He came to conquer. The clash began at the Granicus River, where Alexander's forces, though outnumbered, fought with the fury of men who believed their leader was destined for glory. The river ran red with the blood of Persian soldiers, their cries drowned by the triumphant roar of the Macedonians. The victory was only the beginning. At Issus, Darius III himself faced Alexander, commanding a vast army that stretched beyond sight. But it was not numbers that decided the day, it was strategy, and Alexander's brilliance left the Persian king fleeing for his life. The heart of the Persian Empire awaited: Babylon, Persepolis, Susa, cities whose names carried the weight of history. When Alexander marched into Babylon, its gates opened not with defiance, but with awe. The people, tired of conflict, welcomed him as a liberator. He stood in the grand halls where Cyrus and Darius had ruled, but he did not destroy. Instead, he absorbed. Alexander was not just a conqueror, he was a student of the world, and he sought to understand the lands he claimed. But in Persepolis, the tides of mercy shifted. The halls of the Achaemenid kings, with their towering columns and intricate carvings, were set aflame. Some say it was vengeance for Persia's earlier invasion of Greece, others say it was the folly of a drunken celebration. Whatever the reason, the fires consumed not only stone and wood but centuries of Persian pride. Alexander stood watching, the flames reflected in his eyes, a man who had defeated his greatest rival but could not quench his hunger for more. With the fall of Persia, the Middle East became a crossroads of cultures, a fusion that began with Alexander's vision. He encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women, blending bloodlines and traditions. Cities like Alexandria, which he founded, became centers of knowledge and trade, where Greek ideas mingled with the wisdom of the East. Libraries were filled with scrolls that carried the thoughts of philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers from every corner of the known world. But Alexander's empire, vast as it was, could not hold together after his death. At just 32, he succumbed to fever in Babylon, leaving behind a legacy that burned as brightly as it was short-lived. His generals, unable to agree on a single successor, carved his empire into pieces. Among them, the Seleucid Empire rose in the heart of the Middle East, a testament to Alexander's enduring influence. The Seleucids, inheritors of both Greek and Persian traditions, ruled a land where cultures collided. They built cities that echoed with the voices of many tongues, where temples to Greek gods stood beside Zoroastrian fire altars. It was a time of innovation, of art and science blooming in ways that neither Greece nor Persia could have achieved alone. Yet, the Seleucid rulers faced the same challenge as Alexander, the vastness of the land. Rebellion simmered, and external threats loomed. Still, for a time, the Seleucid Empire was a bridge between worlds, where Greek drama was performed in the shadow of Babylonian ziggurats, and Eastern philosophies found a voice in Western minds. The story of Alexander and the Seleucids is one of ambition that knew no limits, of cultures that blended to create something new, and of an era when the boundaries of the known world were pushed farther than ever before. It is a story etched into the land itself, and ruins that whisper of a time when a young king dared to imagine the impossible and almost succeeded. The sun cast its relentless heat over the arid lands of the Levant, a region caught in the crossfire of two colossal powers. From the west came the disciplined legions of Rome, their armor gleaming under the sun, their banners casting shadows on the sand. From the east came the resilient forces of Parthia, masters of swift cavalry and endless endurance. Between them lay a land rich in culture, faith, and trade, a land that would shape their rivalry and bear its scars. The Romans were no strangers to conquest. With their precise formations and relentless strategy, they carved their dominion into lands far and wide. When they entered the Levant, it was not with hesitation but with the confidence of rulers who believed their way was inevitable. They built roads that stretched like veins through the land, connecting cities and towns to the greater Roman world. They raised amphitheaters where laughter and applause rang out, aqueducts that carried life-giving water, and temples that honored their gods alongside those of the people they ruled. Yet, the Levant was not merely a possession to be taken. It was a place of profound spiritual and cultural significance. The Romans quickly realized this was no ordinary province. In Jerusalem, the echoes of ancient faith clashed with the ambitions of an empire. The temple, a symbol of Jewish identity, stood as a proud testament to a people who would not easily be subdued. Rebellion simmered under the surface, boiling over in moments of fiery resistance. Roman legions responded with brutal efficiency, but they could not extinguish the resilience of the Levant's people. As the Roman banners flew high over the Levant, another power loomed to the east. The Parthian Empire, with its sprawling territories and wealth, was a formidable rival. The Parthians were not a people to be easily subdued. Their warriors, mounted on swift horses, struck like lightning and vanished into the horizon before Roman swords could meet them. Their arrows, shot with precision even while retreating, became the stuff of legend and fear. The Parthians didn't merely fight for land, they fought to preserve their way of life. They controlled vast trade routes, including the fabled Silk Road, which carried treasures from the east to the west. Spices, silk, and jewels flowed through their lands, enriching their coffers and ensuring their power. The Romans, despite their might, could not match the Parthians' mastery of these routes. Trade became another battlefield, where each empire sought to outmaneuver the other without swords. At Carrhae, the rivalry reached a fever pitch. The Roman general Crassus, ambitious and desperate for glory, led his forces into Parthian territory. But the sands of Mesopotamia swallowed his army whole. Parthian horsemen, clad in glittering armor and wielding their deadly bows, rained destruction upon the Roman legions. Crassus, humiliated and defeated, met his end far from the marble halls of Rome. The battlefield became a stark reminder that Rome's reach had limits, and the Parthians were not to be underestimated. Yet, even as they clashed, these empires shaped one another in ways neither could have foreseen. Roman coins bore the faces of emperors who claimed dominion over lands that had once belonged to Parthia. Parthian art and culture, influenced by the West, reflected a fusion of ideas that transcended borders. Along the Silk Road, Roman glassware found its way to Parthian marketplaces, and Parthian silk adorned the nobility of Rome. The Levant, caught in the middle of this rivalry, bore witness to an era of conflict and exchange. Roman soldiers stood guard over cities where merchants traded goods from India and China. Parthian envoys negotiated with Roman governors, their conversations laced with tension and diplomacy. Temples, markets, and fortresses rose and fell, their stones etched with the silent stories of those who lived through this turbulent time. Through the battles and the trade, the Levant remained a place of resilience. It absorbed the influences of its conquerors without losing its soul. The people, whether under Roman or Parthian rule, continued to build, create, and worship. Their stories, whispered in the streets and sung in the marketplaces, spoke of survival in the face of giants, of a land that refused to be forgotten. And so, the Roman and Parthian rivalry was not just a tale of armies and empires. It was a story of a region that stood at the crossroads of the ancient world, enduring the weight of ambition and the pull of two opposing forces. The Levant spirit, like its sands, could not be erased. It carried the marks of its conquerors but remained steadfast, a witness to history's grandest struggles and its quietest triumphs. The darkness of the Roman dungeons was oppressive, a silence broken only by the faint sound of chains rattling as prisoners shifted in their damp confines. Among them sat a small group of men and women, their faces pale but their eyes resolute. They whispered prayers, words carried softly like fragile embers of hope. Their crime was not theft, rebellion, or treason, it was belief. A belief in a message that had taken root in the sands of the Middle East and was spreading like a quiet wildfire. Christianity was not born in grandeur or power. It began in humble homes and dusty streets, in whispered parables and shared meals. It spread not through conquest, but through hearts touched by the teachings of a man who had walked among the poor, the outcast, and the suffering. Yet, for all its peace, it challenged the empire. It called for a devotion that refused to bow to Roman gods or swear ultimate allegiance to the emperor. And for that, its followers became hunted. Roman persecution was swift and brutal. Christians were rounded up, accused of crimes they did not commit, and condemned in public spectacles designed to instill fear. In grand arenas, they stood before roaring crowds, facing beasts released to tear them apart. But there, in the heart of terror, the courage of the Christians shone. They did not scream or beg. Many knelt in prayer or sang hymns as the crowd jeered and the beasts lunged. The spectacle, intended to destroy their spirit, instead sowed seeds of awe in the hearts of those who watched. Stories of martyrs spread quietly among the faithful. Names like Perpetua and Polycarp were spoken with reverence, their sacrifices etched into the collective memory of a growing community. For every life taken, more were inspired. Secret gatherings became lifelines. In hidden homes and catacombs, they broke bread and shared wine, speaking words that reminded them of the one who had been crucified yet promised life everlasting. The shadows could not hide them forever. The Romans, relentless in their quest to extinguish this new faith, underestimated its resilience. For every edict demanding their loyalty to Roman gods, there was a quiet refusal. For every statue of the emperor, there was a whispered prayer to a power greater than any mortal ruler. Their defiance was not loud, but it was steadfast, unshaken by the looming threat of death. And then, a change began to stir from the most unexpected place, within the heart of the empire itself. Constantine, a man destined to leave an indelible mark on history, marched to battle under a sunlit sky. He was not yet a Christian, but on the eve of his decisive confrontation at the Milvian Bridge, he experienced a vision, a cross, shining brightly, with words that promised victory. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the symbol and marched into battle. Victory was his, and with it came a new path. Under Constantine's rule, the tide began to turn. He declared Christianity the lawful religion, lifting the shadow of persecution that had darkened its early days. For the first time, Christians could openly worship, their prayers rising from the streets instead of underground chambers. Churches were built, their walls echoing with hymns of gratitude. Bishops, once hunted, now gathered openly to discuss and shape their faith. Yet, this transformation was not without its struggles. The faith that had survived in the shadows now stood under the sun, exposed to the complexities of politics and power. Constantine's conversion brought both opportunity and challenge. The faith that had once been a symbol of resistance now intertwined with the empire that had sought to destroy it. It became a thread in the fabric of Rome, shaping laws, art, and culture. From humble beginnings to imperial halls, Christianity's rise in the Middle East was a story of endurance and transformation. It was carried on the backs of the oppressed, the whispers of the faithful, and the vision of an emperor who dared to change course. What began as a message of love and sacrifice in the heart of the Middle East had risen against all odds, leaving a mark on the world that time itself could not erase. The desert stretched endlessly, a vast ocean of sand under a blistering sun. The wind carried whispers of ancient stories, of gods and idols worshipped for generations. In the heart of this harsh yet mesmerizing land was Mecca, a bustling city at the crossroads of trade routes, where merchants spoke in many tongues and the Kaaba stood surrounded by stone idols. Life was woven with the fabric of tribal loyalties and feuds, where honor and survival ruled above all. Amidst the noise and chaos, a boy named Muhammad was born into the Quraysh tribe. He never knew his father, who had died before his birth, and soon lost his mother too. Orphaned and vulnerable, he grew up under the care of his grandfather and later his uncle. But even as a child, there was something remarkable about him. People called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, for his honesty and kindness stood out in a world often clouded by deceit. As he grew, Muhammad walked the paths of Mecca as a merchant, known for his fairness and integrity. He sought solitude in the quietness of the mountains, retreating to a cave in Mount Hira. It was there, in the stillness of a night like no other, that his life changed forever. He was enveloped by a presence, a force so overwhelming that it made his heart race and his body tremble. A voice spoke, commanding him to recite. "I cannot," he stammered. But the voice came again, insistent, undeniable. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created," it said. Those words, carried by the angel Gabriel, marked the beginning of a revelation that would change the course of history. Muhammad was terrified, unsure of what had just happened. He rushed home to his wife, Khadijah, seeking comfort and reassurance. She wrapped him in a cloak, listened to his fears, and with unwavering faith in her husband, told him that he was chosen for something greater. The words continued to come, not all at once but over years, a divine guidance shaping his understanding of life, humanity, and the Creator. These revelations spoke of one God, rejecting the many idols that stood in the Kaaba. They called for justice, compassion, and humility, challenging the greed and corruption that thrived in Mecca. But such teachings were not welcomed by the powerful Quraysh leaders. They saw in Muhammad's words a threat to their authority, their wealth, and their traditions. They mocked him, called him mad, and tried to silence him. Yet, he continued, speaking with a conviction that could not be shaken. His followers grew, first a few, then dozens, people who found in his message a hope they had never known. The persecution began in earnest. The early Muslims were beaten, starved, and tortured. Some were killed. The cries of those who refused to renounce their faith echoed through the streets of Mecca, a stark testament to the cost of belief. Muhammad himself faced threats and insults, but he remained steadfast, a leader whose strength gave others the courage to endure. As the hostility intensified, Muhammad and his followers were forced to flee, leaving behind their homes and the city they loved. They made their way to Medina, where they were welcomed and found a place to build a new community. It was here that Muhammad's teachings began to shape not just individual lives, but a society, laying the foundation for a way of life rooted in faith and justice. He was not just a prophet but a statesman, a military leader, and a guide. Under his leadership, the bonds of tribalism gave way to unity under a shared belief. The battles they fought were not just for survival but for the right to believe and to worship freely. Every victory and every loss carried lessons that would resonate through the ages. When Mecca finally opened its gates to him, it was not with vengeance that Muhammad entered, but with mercy. He forgave those who had driven him out, who had plotted against him and his followers. The idols that had stood in the Kaaba for generations were destroyed, their remnants swept away as the call to prayer echoed through the city. Muhammad's life was not marked by luxury or ease. He lived simply, slept on a mat, and ate sparingly. But his heart was vast, filled with compassion for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. His words brought solace to the grieving and strength to the weak. His teachings bridged the gap between the divine and the human, offering a path not of blind obedience but of understanding and love. From the sands of Arabia, his message spread, carried by those who believed in its truth and its promise. Muhammad's life was a testament to the power of faith, resilience, and the profound change that can arise from one man's unwavering devotion to a cause greater than himself. The echoes of his voice, the weight of his words, and the legacy of his actions continue to shape lives, their impact as enduring as the desert itself. The air was heavy with anticipation as the banners of Islam fluttered under a relentless sun. In the years after the Prophet Muhammad's passing, the world seemed to tremble on the edge of something immense and unstoppable. Leaders had emerged, not kings or emperors, but men who carried the weight of their faith and the hope of their people. They were the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, entrusted to continue the legacy that had begun in the deserts of Arabia. Abu Bakr, the first of them, stood with quiet strength, his resolve unshaken even as the young Muslim community faced rebellion and dissent. His heart ached for his friend, the Prophet, yet he knew the weight of responsibility now rested on his shoulders. It was under his leadership that the first great campaigns began, a ripple that would soon become a wave. From the heart of Medina, armies moved with a unity that astounded the fractured empires of Persia and Byzantium. They carried not just swords but a message, one that spoke of justice, faith, and the promise of a world where the oppressed could find refuge. When Abu Bakr passed, Umar ibn al-Khattab took his place, a towering figure whose name would echo through history. He was fierce, yet his rulings were marked by fairness. His eyes saw beyond conquest. He envisioned governance that served the people, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Cities like Damascus and Jerusalem, once jewels of the Byzantine world, opened their gates not to pillagers but to armies that brought stability and new laws. Umar walked through the streets of his expanding empire, dressed humbly, asking about the welfare of his people, and ensuring that no child went hungry. Under Umar, the sands of Arabia became stepping stones to lands of unimaginable richness. Persia fell, its great palaces yielding to a faith that captivated hearts as much as it commanded armies. The call to prayer resounded in places where it had never been heard before, and new converts stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had witnessed the early days in Mecca. The Rashidun were not infallible. Uthman ibn Affan, the third caliph, faced growing discontent as the rapid expansion of Islam brought both riches and challenges. His heart was generous, yet his governance struggled to balance loyalty and fairness. In the end, his leadership came to a tragic conclusion, his life taken in his own home. The ink of his written Quran would preserve the words of God, but the blood on its pages told of divisions that could not be ignored. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, took the mantle amidst the storm. His was a time of turbulence, of battles fought not with strangers, but with those who had once prayed together. Yet, Ali's wisdom shone in his words, his letters, and his unyielding dedication to justice. He was a man whose strength lay not just in his sword but in his heart, even as the world around him fractured into rivalries and misunderstandings. The Rashidun era ended, but its spirit lingered, carried forward by the Umayyads. From their new capital in Damascus, the Umayyad caliphs looked outward, their ambition boundless. The sands of North Africa felt the footsteps of their armies, and the waves of the Atlantic lapped at their new horizons. In the east, their banners flew over the Indus River, touching lands that had never known the teachings of Islam. The Umayyads were builders as much as they were conquerors. Cities flourished under their reign, adorned with mosques whose minarets reached for the heavens. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem stood as a testament to their vision, its golden dome catching the first light of dawn as if proclaiming the glory of the faith it represented. Arabic became not just the language of prayer but of governance, scholarship, and art, weaving together a diverse empire. The Silk Road thrived under their protection, its caravans carrying silks, spices, and knowledge between the east and west. Travelers and traders marveled at the roads that stretched across continents, the bustling markets where merchants spoke in many tongues, and the libraries where ideas from Greece, Persia, and India found a new home. But not all was peaceful. The Umayyads ruled with strength, yet they could not escape the tensions that came with power. Their wealth and privilege alienated some, and their reliance on Arab elites often left others feeling excluded. Still, their reign marked an era where the faith that had been born in Mecca reached the farthest corners of the known world, transforming landscapes, cultures, and hearts. It was a time when the world watched in awe as a civilization rose, shaped by ideals that inspired loyalty and debate, unity and struggle. From the Rashidun to the Umayyads, the story was not just one of conquest but of dreams and the human spirit reaching for something greater, something that would endure for centuries to come. In the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, beneath the vast sky of Baghdad, the streets buzzed with life. Merchants from distant lands haggled in the markets, and scholars gathered in the shadows of the Grand Palace, where the caliphs, descendants of the Prophet's family, ruled not with iron fists, but with wisdom, vision, and an unyielding thirst for knowledge. The air was thick with the scent of spices and ink, with the promise of discovery at every turn. The Golden Age had arrived, an era like no other, where the world felt small and full of possibility. It was a time when minds could wander freely, unshackled by the rigid limits of tradition. Everywhere you turned, there was something to marvel at. From the bustling alleys of Baghdad to the quiet libraries that whispered secrets of ancient wisdom, the pursuit of knowledge was at the heart of it all. The light of reason spread from this capital, shining across continents, filling minds with new ideas, and changing the course of human history forever. At the very center of this awakening was the House of Wisdom, a place of such profound importance that its very name echoes through time. Here, scholars, Persians, Arabs, Indians, and even Greeks, came together in unity, their minds as sharp as the quills they wielded. They translated texts from the farthest reaches of the known world, from the works of Aristotle and Plato to the ancient scrolls of India and China. In this melting pot of cultures, knowledge flowed like a river, unrestrained, pooling together to form a sea of discovery. The air inside the House of Wisdom was thick with a sense of urgency. The sound of quills scratching on parchment filled the air, while scholars debated fiercely. Their words sparked flames of curiosity, kindling the minds of those who listened. mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, fields that had once been confined to the dusty corners of the world, were now studied with an intensity that would transform them forever. They pushed the boundaries of human understanding, creating new worlds of thought and wonder. Al-Khwarizmi, the brilliant mathematician, stood at the heart of this intellectual renaissance, his mind tirelessly working to define the very foundations of algebra. His books, filled with symbols and equations, would one day revolutionize mathematics, giving birth to the algorithms that would shape the digital age. His work was not just about numbers, it was a search for order in the chaos of the universe. Through his equations, the mysteries of the stars, the earth, and the very fabric of existence seemed just within reach. In the same halls, astronomers like Al-Fazari and Al-Battani charted the heavens, mapping the stars with an accuracy that would not be matched for centuries. They measured the distance between the Earth and the Sun, calculated the length of the year, and created instruments that could predict the movement of the planets with astonishing precision. It was as though they held the universe in their hands, unlocking the secrets of the night sky, their eyes gazing into the vastness of space, dreaming of what lay beyond. Meanwhile, doctors and philosophers, inspired by the ancient wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, studied the human body as though it were a sacred temple, trying to understand the delicate balance that kept it alive. Al-Razi, a physician of extraordinary skill, studied diseases with the precision of a surgeon. His work in medicine saved countless lives, and his thoughts on hygiene and patient care became the bedrock of modern medical practice. Every time a patient left his care, they didn't just leave healthier, they left with the hope that humanity could, one day, conquer all ailments. Yet, this was not just an age of scientific wonder. It was also a time when poets and scholars looked inward, questioning the very essence of what it meant to be human. The golden age of the Abbasids was not just about progress in fields like medicine or mathematics, it was also about the search for meaning, for truth. The poets of this era captured the heart of this quest. Their verses were steeped in mysticism, painting pictures of love, loss, and devotion, as though their words could reach into the soul and unlock its deepest desires. Trade, too, flourished during this time, connecting the Abbasid Empire to distant lands. The Silk Road, winding its way through deserts and mountains, brought goods from China, India, and Europe. The marketplace in Baghdad was a tapestry of cultures, where ideas, goods, and philosophies crossed paths. The scent of incense mingled with the sharp tang of leather, while the soft hum of merchants' voices promised treasures from the farthest corners of the earth. This cultural exchange was not just about goods, it was about the exchange of knowledge, where one idea could change the course of history. Yet, even as Baghdad basked in the light of its golden age, there were signs that the world was changing. The very advancements that had once brought such promise began to create divisions. As society grew more complex, so did its challenges. The very wealth and knowledge that flourished in the great city were now fueling rivalries and struggles for power. The caliphate, once united, began to fracture as different factions vied for control. The House of Wisdom, once a symbol of unity, found itself increasingly under threat, its ideas challenged by forces that were more interested in dominance than in discovery. Through it all, the legacy of the Abbasid Golden Age remained. It lived on in the books that filled the libraries of the world, and the equations that still guided scientists centuries later, and the teachings that would one day ignite the Renaissance in Europe. The minds that had shaped this golden age had built something eternal, something that would endure long after the caliphate itself had faded into history. In the halls of the House of Wisdom, where quills once scratched against parchment and eyes burned with the intensity of 1,000 questions, the promise of knowledge never truly died. It became a beacon, a light that would continue to guide generations, long after the shadows of empire had fallen. The sun burned high above, its relentless heat making the desert sands shimmer with an almost unbearable intensity. A quiet unease rippled through the ranks of the soldiers, their armor clinking softly as they shifted in place. On the horizon, the towering walls of Jerusalem rose up like a challenge, a city both holy and coveted. The First Crusade had begun, and the world was about to be set on fire. For centuries, the lands between Europe and the Middle East had been places of bustling trade, vibrant cultures, and rich spiritual traditions. But when the call to arms rang out, it shattered the peaceful facade. Knights, peasants, and kings marched together, driven by promises of redemption, land, and glory. They believed they were on a divine mission, anointed to reclaim the Holy Land from those they viewed as enemies of God. On the other side, the people of Jerusalem looked out with trepidation, knowing that war had come to their doorstep. Their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't fathom. The Crusaders had been taught that this was a holy war, one where salvation was guaranteed, but at what cost? The clash of swords, the cries of battle, and the endless pursuit of power would echo across both continents for generations. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with bloodshed as the Crusaders stormed the city, their mission clear: to seize control, to push back the forces of Islam, and to claim the city as their own. The city that had seen centuries of conquest and faith was torn apart by the fury of the invaders. Walls that had withstood countless assaults crumbled under the weight of religious zeal, and the blood of thousands soaked into the ground. The Crusaders, believing they were doing God's will, slaughtered men, women, and children alike, their fury an all-consuming force. But as the dust settled and the city fell under Christian control, it was clear that the battle for Jerusalem was not just a war of arms, but of ideologies, of faith, and of civilizations. The Crusades were more than just military campaigns. They were a series of violent collisions between two worlds that had long been on a slow and steady course of change. A world where the Christian West, once distant, now reached out with unyielding hands, determined to reshape the East in its image. The Crusades left a scar on the landscape that would never fully heal. The streets of Jerusalem, once a place of peace for so many, became a battlefield where cultures collided. For the Crusaders, it was a war to reclaim what they believed was theirs. For the people of the Middle East, it was an invasion of their sacred land, a challenge to everything they knew. It was a clash of civilizations that would alter the course of history forever. But the consequences of the Crusades weren't limited to just the lands they fought over. Across Europe, the impact was felt too. The knights and soldiers who had marched to the Holy Land returned, bringing with them new ideas, strange goods, and tales of a world that was far older, far richer, and far more complex than they could have ever imagined. The Crusades opened up Europe to the East in ways that had never been possible before. Trade routes were opened, and the flow of knowledge began to pass more freely between the two worlds. The West was introduced to the sophistication of Eastern medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, knowledge that would fuel the Renaissance in the centuries to come. Yet, these exchanges, while enriching, were also tinged with bitterness. As much as Europe gained, the Middle East lost. The Crusades were not just about military conquest, they were about trying to impose a single, unified way of thinking on the region. They were a reminder of the brutal truth that the clash of civilizations often comes at the expense of human lives and cultures. In the aftermath, the Crusades left both the Middle East and Europe irrevocably changed. In the Middle East, the Christian presence left behind scars that lingered for centuries. The Crusader states that were established in the wake of the invasions, though eventually overrun, left behind traces of Western influence that could never be entirely erased. The people of the region were forever shaped by the violence and upheaval of those years, even as they rebuilt their lives and cultures. The kingdoms of Europe, too, were changed by the Crusades. They became more aware of the vastness of the world beyond their borders, as the winds of change from the east began to blow across the continent. The trade routes to the east opened up new possibilities for commerce, and the desire for exotic goods like silk, spices, and precious gems grew. But with that came a deeper understanding of the cultural and intellectual wealth that existed in the East, ideas that had been ignored for so long. But as the Crusades faded into history, they left behind a legacy that was anything but forgotten. The West and East remained locked in a dance, their histories intertwined, their fates forever linked by a past marked by bloodshed, conquest, and the search for glory. For centuries, the echoes of the Crusades would ring out, a reminder that the world is far more connected and far more fragile than we often care to acknowledge. The final chapter of the Crusades may have ended with the fall of the last Crusader stronghold in the Middle East, but the story didn't stop there. The legacy of those long wars shaped the future in ways no one could have predicted. The Middle East, scarred yet resilient, would continue to be a place of profound change and cultural exchange. And Europe, having glimpsed the riches of the East, would forever strive to understand and control the world beyond its borders. The clash of civilizations had left its mark, and the world would never be the same. But the story of the Crusades is not just about the horrors of war, it is about the complexities of human desire, the endless pursuit of power, and the way history, through all its bloodshed, shapes the world we know today. The wind howled through the vast plains, carrying with it a chilling promise of change. Beneath the endless sky, the Seljuk soldiers gathered, their eyes fixed on the horizon. It was a moment suspended in time as the world around them shifted, slowly but surely. In the distance, a rising empire, forged through grit and determination, was taking root. The Seljuks had arrived, and with them came the hope of a new order. The Seljuk Empire grew with the power of a storm. It was the kind of rise that felt destined, like the earth itself had opened up to make room for them. The Seljuks, originally nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, had carved their path through the Middle East with relentless precision. Like wolves closing in on their prey, they took control of vast lands, stretching from Persia to Anatolia, their influence casting a long shadow across the region. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once been the beacon of the Islamic world, had begun to crumble, and in its place, the Seljuks emerged as a powerful force. The people of the lands they conquered were uncertain at first. The old ways were being replaced with new ones, and the dust of battle still hung heavy in the air. But the Seljuks, for all their warrior fierceness, brought with them a promise of stability. They were not just conquerors, they were rulers with vision. They established a government that blended Islamic traditions with the nomadic values of their ancestors. The rise of the Seljuks was more than just the expansion of land, it was the rebirth of a culture that would influence generations to come. But even as the Seljuks built their empire, a dark storm was gathering on the horizon, one that would tear through the heart of the region with a fury unmatched in history. The Mongols, led by the unstoppable force of Genghis Khan, were coming. The earth trembled at their approach. It was said that the Mongols moved like a flood, uncontainable, overwhelming, relentless. They swept through the lands of the Seljuks with a speed and violence that left no time for resistance. Cities that had once stood proud for centuries were reduced to rubble. The Mongol conquests were a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They brought death, destruction, and despair in their wake, leaving entire civilizations broken, unable to recover from the scale of their devastation. The Seljuk Empire, once a shining beacon of hope, fell to the Mongol tide. The great cities of the Middle East, including the Seljuk capital, were sacked and burned. People who had once lived in peace found themselves running for their lives, watching as everything they had known turned to ash. The Mongol armies were a machine of destruction, their horsemen moving like a dark cloud, swallowing everything in their path. The once vibrant markets, the libraries filled with knowledge, the grand mosques that had stood for generations, all were consumed by the wrath of the invaders. It was hard to imagine how anyone could rise from such devastation. How could a people, whose cities were reduced to rubble, whose cultures were crushed underfoot, ever rebuild? The Mongol conquests were so complete, so total, that it seemed the world itself had ended. But history has a way of surprising even the most hardened hearts. From the ashes of the Seljuk Empire, new empires and kingdoms began to emerge, slowly but surely. The Seljuks, for all their losses, had left behind a legacy. Their culture, their institutions, and their knowledge did not vanish with the flames. In the wake of destruction, the people of the Middle East began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but from the ruins, new hope began to rise. The legacy of the Seljuk Empire endured through the efforts of those who survived. The Seljuks had brought with them a culture of learning, of arts, and of intellectual pursuit. Even as their empire fell, these ideals remained. Scholars, poets, and philosophers continued their work, preserving the wisdom of their forebears. The art and architecture that flourished under Seljuk rule continued to inspire, and the people, though scarred, carried on the traditions that had been passed down to them. The Mongols, too, left their mark on the region, though not in the way many expected. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants, the Mongols began to settle into the lands they had conquered. They adopted local customs, learned from the cultures they had destroyed, and established a new kind of rule. They were no longer just marauders, they were rulers in their own right. In time, the Mongols themselves became part of the fabric of the Middle East, blending their heritage with that of the people they had once sought to conquer. As the years passed, the Middle East would never quite return to what it had been before. The scars of the Mongol conquests were deep, and the world had changed forever. But out of the ashes of that destruction came a new world, one that was shaped by the Seljuks, the Mongols, and the people who had endured. It was a world built on resilience, on the idea that even after the worst of calamities, there is always hope. There is always a chance to rebuild. In the end, the rise of the Seljuks and the devastation wrought by the Mongol invasions were both a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Though the empires that came before may have crumbled, their legacies lived on in the hearts and minds of those who survived. And as the Middle East rebuilt itself, it carried with it the lessons learned from the past, that even in the darkest moments, there is always the potential for renewal, for growth, and for the creation of something new. The sky darkened with the sound of hooves pounding the earth, a low, rumbling roar that echoed across the plains. The Mongols were coming again. Their war cries, carried by the wind, rang out as the ground trembled beneath them. This time, they would face something different, something that would change the course of history. The Mamluks, an elite force of slave soldiers who had been forged in the fires of battle, stood ready. In the heart of Egypt, under the leadership of their commander, the Mamluks had risen from humble beginnings. Once slaves, they had become some of the most feared warriors in the world. With every blow of their swords and every gallop of their horses, they had earned their place in history. And now, with the Mongols threatening to sweep across the region once again, the Mamluks would stand their ground. The clash between the Mamluks and the Mongols would become legendary. It was a battle not just of armies, but of ideals. The Mongols, a force of destruction and chaos, believed in sweeping away everything in their path. The Mamluks, on the other hand, fought to protect everything they had built. They fought for their homes, their people, and their very way of life. When the Mongols stormed into the Levant, they found themselves not facing an easy victory but a battle that would test them to their very core. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The Mongols, confident in their ability to conquer, met the Mamluks on the field. But something remarkable happened. The Mamluks, with their discipline and fierce determination, struck back with a force that surprised the world. They broke the Mongol advance, stopping their westward expansion in its tracks. It was a turning point, a victory that proved that even the greatest of armies could be defeated. The Mamluks, after that fateful battle, became the protectors of the Middle East. They took control of Egypt and the Levant, ushering in an era of stability and strength. They were not just warriors, they were rulers, builders of a new order in the region. Under their rule, the Middle East flourished. Trade routes opened, the economy thrived, and the arts and sciences were nurtured. The Mamluks had forged a legacy that would stand the test of time. But as one empire rose, another was quietly building, biding its time. The Ottomans were coming. In the north, across the Bosphorus, a new force was gathering strength. They were the descendants of a people who had once lived as nomads on the edge of the world, but now they were becoming something much more. The Ottomans were rising, and they would soon change the landscape of the Middle East forever. The early Ottomans were a small and humble group, led by a man named Osman. He was a leader of vision, with the courage to dream of a new empire that would stretch across continents. The seeds of the Ottoman Empire had been planted, and as Osman and his followers carved out their place in the world, the Ottomans began to show the world what they were capable of. But in those early days, it wasn't just the military prowess of the Ottomans that would set them apart. It was their ability to adapt, to learn, to evolve. Osman's successors, the early Ottoman rulers, knew that to grow, they had to absorb the best aspects of the cultures around them. They took from the Seljuks, the Persians, and the Byzantines, blending their traditions and knowledge into something uniquely Ottoman. The rise of the Ottoman Empire was a quiet storm. It wasn't marked by one grand battle or sudden conquest, but rather by a steady accumulation of power. As the Ottomans expanded into the Balkans, they began to carve a new path in history. They conquered cities, but they didn't just take, they transformed. The lands they claimed didn't become ruins. Instead, they flourished under Ottoman rule, becoming centers of culture, trade, and learning. The Ottomans knew that their strength lay not just in their military might, but in their ability to unite disparate peoples. They built a society that was both strong and flexible, a society that could absorb the diverse cultures, languages, and religions of the vast territories they controlled. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were also visionaries, seeing the world not as a series of battles to be won, but as a mosaic of people and ideas to be united. But even as the Ottomans grew, they knew that the Mamluks, their southern neighbors, stood as a powerful rival. The two empires watched each other closely, each aware of the other's strength. The Mamluks, with their hard-won victories and deep-rooted traditions, were not easily swayed. The Ottomans, meanwhile, grew more ambitious with each passing day, their eyes set on expanding southward. It wasn't long before the two powers would collide. The struggle between the Mamluks and the Ottomans was inevitable. For years, the two empires had lived side by side, each quietly strengthening itself for the day when they would face each other in battle. That day came in 1516, at the Battle of Marj Dabik. The Ottomans, now led by Sultan Selim I, marched south, determined to break the Mamluk hold on Egypt. The Mamluks, with all their history and power, met the Ottomans in a fierce clash. In the end, it was the Ottomans who triumphed. The Mamluks, despite their strength and resilience, fell to the superior Ottoman forces. The Ottomans claimed Egypt, solidifying their control over the Middle East and cementing their place as one of the world's greatest empires. The defeat of the Mamluks marked the beginning of the end of an era. The Ottoman Empire, now in control of vast territories from the heart of Anatolia to the edges of North Africa, would continue to grow and evolve for centuries. But the Mamluks, despite their fall, had left behind a legacy of resistance, strength, and honor that would never be forgotten. And so, the story of the Mamluks and the Ottomans became a part of the Middle East's rich history. Two empires, one rising and one falling, each with its own vision of the future, each shaping the region in its own way. The Mamluks had stood strong against the Mongol tide, and the Ottomans, with their quiet rise, had built an empire that would last for centuries. Their stories, though different, were intertwined by the same unbreakable thread of history. The earth trembled as the sounds of the siege grew louder, the air thick with tension and anticipation. In the year 1453, the once mighty walls of Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, stood tall and proud, guarding the heart of an empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. Yet, as the Ottoman forces closed in, something was stirring in the air, something that hinted at a momentous shift in history. The Ottomans, led by a young sultan named Mehmed II, were on the brink of what would become one of the most iconic moments in world history, the fall of Constantinople. As the siege began, the city braced for its fate. Inside, the citizens, surrounded by ancient walls that had withstood countless attacks over the centuries, held onto their hope. They believed the city's walls could protect them one more time. But there was something different this time. The Ottomans were not like any force the city had faced before. They had weapons and strategies that defied imagination. Mehmed's forces had brought with them the world's largest cannons, capable of shaking the very foundations of the walls that had stood for centuries. The Ottomans were relentless. For weeks, they pounded the walls, sending shockwaves through the city. The air was filled with the roar of the cannons and the clash of steel, as the defenders fought with everything they had to protect their beloved city. The streets ran red with the blood of the fallen, but the Ottomans did not falter. They had come with one goal in mind, to conquer Constantinople and secure the future of their empire. And then, on May 29, 1453, the inevitable happened. The walls that had held for so long crumbled under the relentless assault. The city fell. Constantinople was no more, its proud legacy reduced to dust. Mehmed II, the conqueror, stood at the gates of the city and declared it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, renaming it Istanbul. A new chapter in history was born, one that would shape the future of not just the Middle East, but the entire world. The conquest of Constantinople was not just a military victory. It marked the birth of a new empire, an empire that would stretch across 3 continents and last for over 400 years. Mehmed II was not just a conqueror, he was a visionary. He understood that the world was changing, and in order for the Ottomans to thrive, they would have to transform not just their military, but their governance, culture, and society as well. Under Ottoman rule, Istanbul flourished. The city, once a symbol of Christian dominance, was now a beacon of Islamic power. Mehmed's vision for the city was clear. He sought to blend the best of the Byzantine and Ottoman worlds, creating a vibrant, cosmopolitan metropolis where different cultures, religions, and traditions could coexist. The city became a melting pot, a place where scholars, artists, and traders from all corners of the empire could come together and exchange ideas. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were builders. Under Mehmed's rule, the Ottomans invested heavily in infrastructure, turning Istanbul into one of the most advanced cities in the world. The grand mosques and palaces that dotted the skyline were a testament to the empire's wealth and power. The Hagia Sophia, once a symbol of Christian glory, was transformed into a mosque, its magnificent dome now a reflection of Ottoman grandeur. But it wasn't just the architecture that flourished. The Ottomans were patrons of the arts, encouraging the growth of literature, music, and science. Scholars from across the empire flocked to Istanbul, bringing with them knowledge that would help shape the future. The Ottomans valued learning and intellectual exchange, and their support of education laid the groundwork for a cultural renaissance that would echo throughout the centuries. Trade flourished under Ottoman rule as well. The empire sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and its strategic location made it a hub for merchants from every corner of the globe. Goods, ideas, and cultures flowed through the empire, enriching both the Ottoman heartland and the lands beyond. The Ottomans understood the power of trade, and they worked tirelessly to expand their influence, creating a vast network of commerce that connected the East and the West. But the Ottomans also faced challenges. The vastness of their empire brought with it the complexities of governance. The Ottomans ruled over a diverse population, and they had to navigate the delicate balance of keeping their subjects content while maintaining control. Yet, the Ottomans had a unique approach to governance. Rather than impose a rigid, one-size-fits-all system, they allowed a degree of autonomy to the various regions and peoples under their rule. They governed with a light touch, allowing local customs and traditions to thrive, while also imposing a sense of unity and order across their vast empire. One of the key factors that helped the Ottomans maintain such a vast and diverse empire was their military prowess. The Janissaries, an elite corps of soldiers, were the backbone of the Ottoman army. They were highly disciplined and fiercely loyal to the Sultan. The Janissaries played a crucial role in the empire's expansion, ensuring that Ottoman rule was enforced across the lands they conquered. The Ottomans were also masters of diplomacy. They understood the importance of alliances, both within the empire and with foreign powers. They navigated the complex political landscape of Europe, Asia, and Africa with skill, forging alliances when necessary and using their military might when diplomacy failed. The Ottomans were pragmatic rulers, always seeking the best path to secure their empire's future. Yet, despite their military might and cultural contributions, the Ottomans never forgot the importance of faith. Islam was at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and it was this faith that guided their actions. The Ottomans were not just rulers of land, they were stewards of a religious tradition, and they worked tirelessly to spread Islam and protect the sanctity of the faith. Under Ottoman rule, Islam became deeply intertwined with the identity of the empire, shaping not just politics but the daily lives of the people. As the years passed, the Ottoman Empire continued to grow in power and influence. From the conquest of Constantinople to the height of their rule in the 16th century, the Ottomans created a legacy that would endure for centuries. They were conquerors, but they were also creators, builders of a civilization that blended the best of East and West, the old and the new. And as the sun set over the Bosphorus, casting a golden light on the city that had once been the heart of an empire, the Ottomans stood at the crossroads of history, their empire a testament to the enduring power of vision, faith, and resilience. The sun had barely risen over the vast Ottoman Empire, but the once mighty empire already seemed to feel the weight of its age. It was a time when the emperor, once a symbol of unyielding strength and unshakable power, found himself in a room full of advisors, each one offering their opinion with desperate urgency. The sultans had ruled for centuries, their armies conquering lands from Europe to Asia, but now, those same lands were slipping through their fingers. In the distant corners of the empire, whispers of rebellion grew louder. In the heart of the capital, Istanbul, the streets hummed with an energy of frustration and fear. The great empire that had shaped the course of history was starting to crumble. Inside the palace, the once imposing structures seemed to carry a heaviness, a reflection of the empire's deepening struggles. The sultans, who had once been seen as invincible, were now caught in a tug-of-war between competing factions as old alliances began to splinter. The military, once the pride of the empire, was showing signs of wear. The once unbreakable Janissary Corps, whose loyalty had been the empire's backbone, had become a shadow of its former self, rife with corruption and internal strife. The administration was riddled with inefficiency and power struggles that undermined any hope of unity or reform. Outside the palace, the world was changing. Nations that had once bowed before the Ottoman Empire were now rising with power of their own. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Europe, and with it came new weapons, new technology, and a new way of thinking. The empire, rooted in centuries-old traditions, struggled to keep up. The world was moving faster than the Ottomans could adapt, and the weight of tradition, once their greatest strength, had become their greatest burden. But the pressures the empire faced weren't just internal. The Ottomans were also surrounded by enemies on all sides. The rise of European colonialism had shifted the balance of power, and the Ottoman Empire was caught in the crossfire. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, European powers like Britain, France, and Russia were carving up territories, spreading their influence with ruthless efficiency. The Ottomans watched helplessly as their once proud empire was chipped away, one piece at a time, by colonial powers that had no interest in preserving the balance that had existed for centuries. The colonies were rich with resources that Europe needed to fuel its growing industries, and the Ottomans, once a powerful trading empire, found themselves unable to compete. Ports that had once bustled with the sounds of merchants from around the world now lay silent, as European powers controlled the trade routes. The empire's once thriving cities were now plagued by poverty and stagnation. People who had once looked to their sultans for leadership and guidance began to lose faith, not only in their rulers but in the very idea of an Ottoman future. But it wasn't just the loss of land that caused the empire to bleed. The influence of European colonialism seeped into every facet of life. New ideas of nationalism, of self-determination, of the rights of the people, began to spread across the empire like wildfire. The Ottoman state had once been held together by the strength of its sultans, by the power of Islam, by centuries of tradition. But now, these ideals were being challenged by the cries of oppressed peoples who yearned for freedom and independence. The empire, vast and diverse, was held together by threads that were beginning to snap. The cries for independence grew louder, first from the Balkans, then from the Arab world, and eventually even from the heart of the empire itself. People who had once lived under Ottoman rule began to demand their own nations, their own identities. The Ottoman response was slow and hesitant, a reflection of the empire's inability to adapt to the changing world. The rebellions grew stronger, fueled by the idea that the people deserved more than an empire that was crumbling under its own weight. The sultans, overwhelmed by these internal struggles, called upon their military to restore order. But the Ottomans had once prided themselves on their military prowess, and now they found themselves losing battles against enemies who were better equipped, better organized, and more determined. The empire's old enemies, like the Russians and the British, saw an opportunity to strike at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The once mighty military machine, the pride of the empire, was now facing one defeat after another. And each loss weakened the empire's hold on its territories. But it was not just external enemies that threatened the empire. The rise of nationalism within the Ottoman territories had fueled movements of revolt and separation. What had once been an empire of diverse peoples, united under one banner, now seemed like a patchwork quilt of disgruntled nations, each pulling away from the central authority. The Ottomans struggled to suppress these uprisings, but the more they fought, the more they lost. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire was widely known as the sick man of Europe, a shadow of its former self. Even the empire's cultural influence began to fade. Once the heart of art, science, and architecture, the Ottomans now found themselves eclipsed by the rising powers of Europe. The magnificent mosques and palaces that once adorned Istanbul now stood as reminders of a bygone era, their splendor overshadowed by the world's rapid advancements in industry, technology, and thought. The great Ottoman cities, once centers of learning and culture, were now mere echoes of their former glory. The empire's fall wasn't just a political collapse, it was a loss of identity, a loss of pride. People who had once walked the streets of Constantinople with their heads held high now felt a deep sadness, a sense of helplessness, as the empire crumbled beneath the weight of internal divisions and external pressures. The sultans, who had once held the world in their hands, were now watching as their empire slipped away, powerless to stop it. And as the last remnants of the Ottoman Empire began to fade into history, the world moved on. The colonizers who had once forced their way into the empire's territories now carved up the land into new nations. The legacy of the Ottomans lived on in the hearts of the people, but their empire, their vision, was gone. The end of the Ottoman Empire was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an era, and the beginning of a new world, where the old ways would never again hold sway. The smoke of battle lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as the world found itself trapped in a war like no other. A war that reshaped not only borders but also hearts and minds. The great Ottoman Empire, once the unrivaled power straddling continents, now stood on the brink of collapse. For decades, it had weathered storms, fought battles, and held its vast territory together. But World War I was a storm too fierce, a force too destructive for even the Ottomans to withstand. As the war raged, alliances were formed, promises made, and hopes shattered. Nations were crumbling under the weight of their own ambitions. Amid the chaos, a secret agreement was being forged, one that would change the Middle East forever. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a pact between Britain and France, was a stroke of diplomacy born from betrayal. In hushed whispers behind closed doors, the fates of millions of people were sealed with ink and paper, dividing up the once glorious Ottoman lands like pieces of a puzzle, leaving behind broken promises and shattered lives. The agreement drew lines across the map, lines that did not care for history, culture, or the people who lived there. The Middle East, once united under the Ottoman banner, was now carved into pieces, each part given to a colonial power eager to stake its claim on the region. The promises made to the Arab people, who had risen in revolt against the Ottomans with the hope of freedom and self-determination, were forgotten in the cold light of diplomacy. The map that was drawn did not reflect the desires of those who lived there. It was a map built on the ambitions of distant powers, far removed from the lives of those it would affect. In the streets of the cities that had once been the heart of the Ottoman Empire, there was a sense of betrayal that could be felt in every step. People who had fought and bled for a future of independence suddenly found themselves under the control of foreign rulers who cared nothing for their struggles, their dreams. It was as though the promises made to them had been hollow all along. What was supposed to be a victory had turned into a nightmare, as the agreements of faraway men shattered the hopes of those closest to the land. As the Ottoman Empire crumbled under the pressure of war and diplomacy, something even more devastating began to take shape. The old world, with its empires and sultans, was giving way to something new, a world of nation-states. No longer would borders be drawn by empires or kingdoms, now they would be drawn by the people themselves. But in the wake of that shift, the scars left behind were deep and painful. In the wake of the Ottoman collapse, new nations emerged from the ashes, their borders drawn hastily, without regard for the complexities of the region. The Sykes-Picot Agreement had not just destroyed the Ottoman Empire, it had given birth to new entities that would never quite fit together. The dreams of a united Middle East were swept away as artificial borders were drawn, creating countries that often had little in common with the people who lived within them. Nations were born out of conflict and division, and the consequences of that division would be felt for generations. People who had once seen themselves as part of a larger, shared history now found themselves separated, strangers in their own land. The Ottoman Empire had given them a sense of unity, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. But now, with the empire's fall and the rise of new nation-states, they were left to navigate the chaos of a fractured world, with new rulers who often saw them as little more than a footnote in history. In the aftermath of the war, the wounds of betrayal ran deep. The once proud Ottoman citizens, who had once walked the streets of Istanbul with their heads held high, now found themselves living in the shadow of their former empire. The great cities that had once stood as symbols of power and culture now seemed to be reminders of everything that had been lost. And the people, ordinary men and women who had lived through the empire's greatest triumphs and its most crushing defeats, were left to pick up the pieces of their broken world. It wasn't just the loss of land that hurt, it was the loss of identity, the loss of purpose. The Ottoman Empire had given the people a place in the world, a role in history. But now, with the rise of the nation-state, that place seemed to be slipping away. There were no longer sultans to protect them, no longer an empire to hold them together. The future was uncertain, and the past seemed to be fading, slipping into the pages of history as nothing more than a distant memory. The formation of these new nation-states, born from the chaos of war and the betrayal of promises, was a bittersweet victory for some. They now had a flag to call their own, a name to rally around. But that victory came with a price. The price of division. The price of separation. The price of lost unity. In the years that followed, the scars left by the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the fall of the Ottoman Empire would be felt in the hearts of those who lived through it all. The borders that were drawn with such ease would become the boundaries of conflict, as the people who had once been united under the Ottoman banner found themselves at odds with one another, struggling to reconcile their shared history with the harsh realities of a divided world. And in the quiet of the night, when the stars shone down on the land once known as the Ottoman Empire, there were those who still remembered. They remembered the empire's glory, its promise, and its fall. They remembered the way the world had shifted beneath their feet, how the past had been erased and replaced with something unrecognizable. And though the world around them had changed, though new flags fluttered in the wind and new leaders rose to power, the pain of the past never truly faded. It lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, a reminder of how quickly the world could change, and how deeply that change could cut. In the quiet of a desert evening, where the air hung heavy with silence, the ground below held a secret, one that would change the course of history. Beneath the golden sands, far from the eyes of the world, lay something powerful. Something that would ignite fires of ambition and desire in the hearts of men across the globe. And one fateful day, the earth would give it up. Oil. It was like the land itself had whispered its hidden treasure to those who knew how to listen. And once it was found, everything changed. In a moment, the Middle East was transformed from a region of ancient cultures and timeless stories into the center of a new world order. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century was not just a game changer, it was the game. The world suddenly saw the Middle East not for its rich history or vibrant traditions, but for the black gold that flowed beneath its surface, ready to fuel the engines of a modern age. In cities where the winds once carried the scent of spices and incense, now the air smelled of something different, of progress, of power, of wealth. For some, it was a blessing. For others, it became a curse. The wealth that flowed from the oil fields promised a future of prosperity. But as the money poured in, so did the foreign interests, the foreign powers that sought to control this newfound wealth. Western nations, their economies hungry for fuel to sustain their industrial empires, turned their gaze eastward, toward the deserts of the Middle East. What had once been a quiet region, its people focused on the rhythm of life and faith, was now thrust into the spotlight. The world had a new obsession, and it was buried deep beneath the sand. As oil began to shape the region, the changes were immediate and profound. The streets of once modest cities began to glisten with new construction, the tall buildings reaching for the skies, symbols of the riches that flowed beneath them. The promise of wealth, of a brighter future, was intoxicating. People flocked to the cities, eager to be part of the new world that was unfolding before their eyes. A new era was dawning, one where the old ways seemed to fade in the face of modernity. But as the wealth flowed in, so did the strings attached to it. The Middle East was no longer just a place of ancient wonders and traditions, it was now a chessboard on which the great powers of the West played their game. The Western intervention in the region was not subtle. Governments and corporations, eager to secure their access to oil, forged alliances, made deals, and imposed influence. In many ways, the Middle East became a prize to be fought over, its resources treated as a commodity to be bought and sold on the world market. The leaders of the newly rich nations often found themselves caught between the demands of their own people and the pressures from powerful foreign interests. They were no longer just stewards of their nations, they were also key players in a global drama, where oil was the currency of power. But with this newfound wealth came a cost. The transformation of the Middle East, from a region rooted in its ancient ways to one driven by the demands of the oil industry, was not without its sacrifices. The traditional ways of life, once centered around agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship, began to fade. People who had spent generations working the land, nurturing the soil, now found themselves drawn into the promises of a modern life, one that was built on oil. The social fabric of the region was shifting, sometimes tearing, as people moved away from their old villages and into the bustling cities, hoping to catch a piece of the new dream. But the oil was not just a gift, it was a burden. As much as it promised riches, it also sowed the seeds of conflict. The rush to control and exploit the oil reserves brought with it political instability. The once peaceful land now became a battleground of interests. The Middle East, a region that had endured centuries of empires, invasions, and cultural shifts, found itself once again at the mercy of outside forces. The powerful nations that had long coveted the resources of the region began to interfere in ways that would leave lasting scars. In the background, the people of the Middle East watched as their world changed. They saw the new skyscrapers rising in their cities, their streets lined with luxury cars, and yet many felt a growing unease. The wealth that oil had brought did not trickle down evenly. While some became fabulously rich, others were left behind. The gap between the few who controlled the oil and the many who worked to extract it grew wider, creating a sense of frustration and resentment that would simmer beneath the surface for decades to come. The external pressures from Western powers did not help. The influence of foreign governments and multinational corporations in the region's politics and economy began to erode the sovereignty of Middle Eastern nations. The promises of wealth and development, brought by the oil boom, often seemed empty when weighed against the cost of independence. Leaders who had once held power in their own hands found themselves beholden to foreign interests, making decisions that were not always in the best interests of their own people. The oil, instead of being a blessing, often became a chain, binding the region to the whims of distant powers who saw it as little more than a resource to be exploited. As the decades wore on, the Middle East, now rich beyond imagination, also became a place of great tension. The oil that had once seemed like a gift from the earth now felt like a heavy weight, one that demanded a price. The transformation of the region, from quiet deserts and ancient cities to the center of global power struggles, was both thrilling and tragic. In many ways, the discovery of oil had given the Middle East a new lease on life, but it had also forced it to confront its own vulnerability. In the quiet of the desert, where the wind still whispered over the sand, the people of the Middle East could hear the echoes of a time when the land was simple, when it held no great wealth, but also no great conflict. The discovery of oil had brought both wealth and strife, a story of dreams built and lost, of promises made and broken. As the oil flowed, so did the challenges of a rapidly changing world, one that would never be the same again. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the quiet streets, their rhythm heavy with the weight of history. For years, the land had been a place of peaceful coexistence, of communities living side by side, sharing the same soil, breathing the same air. But now, it was different. Now, the tension was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. The promise of a bright future lay shattered in the dust, and the air was thick with uncertainty. It had begun with a question that, in its simplicity, held the power to ignite a firestorm. Who truly belonged to this land? The land that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the land where dreams and hopes were built, only to be torn apart by war and bloodshed. In a place where faith and identity were tied to the earth itself, the answer to that question would not come easily. It would take years, decades even, of conflict and despair before anything resembling an answer could be found. The origins of the conflict were not born of a single moment, but of a series of choices made in the shadows of history, choices that sowed the seeds of division. The arrival of new ideas, the promises of a homeland for one people at the expense of another, set in motion a series of events that would change the course of the region forever. The clash between the Arab and Jewish communities in the heart of the Middle East was not simply a struggle for land, it was a struggle for identity, for survival, for the very essence of belonging. As the years passed, the situation grew more complicated, more bitter. The wars came like waves crashing on a shore, relentless and unyielding. The First War, the War of 1948, was one that left scars on both sides. The creation of the State of Israel was a moment of triumph for many, a long-awaited return to a homeland that had been promised. But for the Arabs, it was a tragedy, a painful reminder of what was lost in the process. Families were displaced, homes were destroyed, and a sense of injustice took root that would never be easily erased. But the war was just the beginning. The years that followed were marked by more bloodshed, more heartbreak. The Six-Day War in 1967 was one of the most defining moments of the conflict, a lightning-fast battle that left the region forever changed. Israel's victory in that war altered the map of the Middle East, but it also deepened the animosity between the Arab nations and the Jewish state. The occupation of Palestinian territories, the rise of militant groups, the cycles of violence, these became the painful rhythm of daily life. Children grew up in the shadow of conflict, their lives defined by the battles fought in the streets, their dreams shaped by the hatred and fear that permeated the air. And yet, even in the darkest moments, there was hope. Hope that somehow, peace might be possible. Peace that had seemed so elusive, so fragile, in the midst of so much hatred. The world watched, waited, and prayed for a breakthrough. And for a brief moment, it seemed that peace might be within reach. In 1978, the Camp David Accords brought a glimmer of light to a region that had known only darkness. The handshake between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was a symbol of something greater, something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Egypt became the first Arab country to recognize Israel, and the promise of peace began to take root. But even as this historic agreement was being signed, the conflict raged on, and the shadows of war lingered. The 1980s and 1990s saw a series of attempts to end the fighting, to bring both sides to the table and find a way forward. The Oslo Accords in 1993, a fragile agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, brought hope that peace could finally be achieved. The image of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn remains one of the most poignant symbols of that hope. But the dreams of peace were shattered when Rabin was assassinated in 1995, a tragic moment that sent shockwaves through the region. The loss of Rabin was a devastating blow to the peace process, and the years that followed were marked by renewed violence and despair. And so the cycle continued. For every step toward peace, there seemed to be two steps backward. The violence never stopped completely, and the pain never truly healed. Children continued to grow up with the sound of gunfire in their ears, with the fear of death hanging over them like a dark cloud. The hope for peace flickered like a candle in the wind, never quite going out, but never strong enough to light the way. The years passed, and the world watched as the region grappled with its own demons. The rise of new political movements, the shifting alliances, the changing faces of leadership, all of these things affected the course of the conflict. Yet the core of the struggle remained the same, the question of who had the right to the land, who had the right to live in peace. Through it all, there were moments of quiet, moments when the world seemed to pause and take a breath. There were moments of reflection when the people of the region, both Jews and Arabs, paused to consider the cost of the conflict, the lives lost, the futures destroyed. But these moments were always fleeting, overtaken by the next round of violence, the next wave of hatred. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not just a political struggle. It is a struggle of hearts and minds, of identity and memory. It is a story of people who have lived through unimaginable pain and loss, who continue to search for something they can hold on to in a world that seems determined to tear them apart. It is a story of hope, of despair, and of the unbreakable will to survive. But it is also a story of something even deeper, of the desire for peace, for reconciliation, for a future where children no longer have to grow up knowing only the sound of gunfire. The land that once held the promise of a shared future now stands as a reminder of the price of division, of the cost of hatred. And yet, even in the darkest moments, the possibility of peace still lingers in the hearts of those who dare to dream. It started with a whisper, then a murmur, then a roar. A quiet discontent that had simmered for years was suddenly bursting through the seams of a tightly controlled society. The streets, once silent under the weight of fear, now echoed with chants of defiance. People, once too afraid to speak their minds, now dared to stand up, to demand what was rightfully theirs, their freedom. The air was thick with anticipation, with the scent of revolution, and with the hope that this time, change was not just a dream. The Iranian Revolution was not just a political shift, it was the birth of something new. For decades, Iran had lived under the rule of a monarch, a ruler who promised prosperity but delivered repression. The Shah, who once seemed untouchable, had lost the hearts and minds of the people. As poverty and inequality spread through the country, the people's frustrations grew, and the streets became a battleground. The power of the people clashed with the old guard, with the forces of tradition and authority. And in the midst of it all was the figure of Ayatollah Khomeini, a man whose presence could not be ignored. From his exile in France, he spoke to the hearts of the oppressed, calling them to rise up against the injustices of the Shah. The people listened. And when the time came, they rose, turning their rage into action. It was a struggle that seemed to pull at the very fabric of society, splitting families, turning friends into enemies, and forcing Iranians to choose sides. The streets of Tehran were filled with the sounds of both hope and fear. Protesters flooded the capital, demanding the fall of the monarchy. For weeks, the revolution spread like wildfire, and the Shah, once a symbol of unchallenged power, found himself fleeing the country. But even in his absence, the revolution was not over. It was only just beginning. Khomeini returned to Iran, not as a symbol of reform, but as the leader of a new order, one that would reshape the country in ways few had imagined. His vision was clear, an Islamic republic, where the will of God would guide the decisions of the state. The dream of freedom, which had been the fire that fueled the revolution, now found itself tempered by religious zeal. Iran, a nation that had fought so hard to free itself from the oppression of the Shah, found itself under the rule of a different kind of authority, one that would shape the course of its future in ways that would resonate for generations. But even as Iran turned inward, as it embraced the new vision of the Islamic Republic, the winds of revolution began to blow elsewhere. The Arab world, long ruled by dictators and monarchs, began to feel the stirrings of discontent. In 2011, what started in Tunisia quickly spread to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and beyond. The Arab Spring was born, and with it came the hope that the people could finally take back what had been taken from them, their voices, their power, their future. The streets of Cairo were filled with millions of people, chanting for the downfall of President Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled Egypt with an iron fist for nearly 30 years. The world watched, captivated by the sight of people from all walks of life, students, workers, professionals, and the unemployed, coming together to demand change. The air was thick with the smell of burning tires, the roar of protests, and the hope that this time, the people would not be ignored. But hope is a fragile thing. In Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, the dictators fell, but what followed was not the promise of peace and stability. It was chaos. Political turmoil erupted, with competing factions fighting for control. militias took over cities, and nations that had once been seen as stable were now engulfed in civil war. What had started as a revolution for freedom, for democracy, turned into a struggle for survival. In Syria, the Arab Spring did not just touch the country, it set it on fire. What began as peaceful protests in 2011 quickly turned into an all-out civil war, one that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and displace millions more. Families were torn apart. Cities were reduced to rubble. The violence was relentless, the suffering unimaginable. And yet, amidst the destruction, there remained the glimmer of a dream, that one day, Syria would be free. But the dream grew dimmer with each passing year, as foreign powers intervened, each pursuing their own agenda, each contributing to the spiraling chaos. What was once a fight for freedom now became a proxy war, a battle between forces that cared little for the people whose lives they were destroying. In Egypt, the fall of Mubarak was followed by the rise of a new leader, Mohammed Morsi. But his time in power was short-lived, and the military returned to control, as if the revolution had never happened. The people of Egypt, who had once filled the streets with cries for democracy, now found themselves once again under the heel of military rule. The hope that had once burned so brightly now flickered like a candle in the wind, vulnerable to the forces of oppression. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's reign came to a violent end, but what followed was a nation divided. The revolution that had once seemed like a triumph of the people now seemed like a tragic mistake. Rival factions, each claiming to represent the will of the people, fought for control of the country. The chaos was overwhelming, and Libya descended into a state of lawlessness, a place where the future seemed impossible to predict. The Arab Spring, which had begun with such promise, had become a nightmare for many. The hopes of millions were dashed, and the people who had dared to dream found themselves caught in a storm they could not escape. The revolutions that had begun with the promise of freedom and democracy were now marked by violence, repression, and uncertainty. But even in the darkest moments, the spirit of revolution endured. The people of the Middle East and North Africa had tasted freedom, and they could not forget it. They had seen what was possible when they stood together, when they refused to be silenced. Though the winds of revolution had turned into storms, the seeds of change had been planted. And in the hearts of those who had fought, who had given everything for their dream, the hope for a better future still flickered, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The hum of commerce filled the air, the sound of voices bargaining in countless languages blending with the distant roar of machinery and the soft hiss of desert winds. In the sprawling ports of Dubai and the crowded bazaars of Istanbul, it was easy to feel the pulse of a region standing at the crossroads of the world. The Middle East, a land where ancient traditions met the unyielding pace of modernity, found itself both bound and fractured by the weight of its alliances, its rivalries, and the ever-shifting currents of a globalized world. It was a land of contradictions, where glittering skyscrapers pierced the heavens, even as millions lived in shadows cast by poverty and strife. Beneath the polished veneer of prosperity in some nations lay a simmering unease, a constant reminder of the region's struggles to balance the forces pulling it in different directions. Old alliances were tested, new rivalries erupted, and the question hung heavy in the air: what kind of future awaited this land of both unimaginable wealth and heartbreaking turmoil? At the heart of this dance of power were the alliances that defined the region's politics. Gulf nations, brimming with oil wealth, banded together under banners of economic cooperation but remained wary of one another. Saudi Arabia, a titan of influence, cast its gaze toward Iran, its ancient rival. The rivalry between these two giants was more than a battle for regional dominance, it was a clash of ideologies, of visions for the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, a champion of Sunni conservatism, and Iran, the flag-bearer of Shia resistance, played out their contest in places far beyond their borders. In Yemen, their rivalry tore through the lives of families, turning vibrant cities into battlegrounds. In Syria, it fueled a war that seemed to have no end. For every soldier fighting on the front lines, there was a mother waiting for a son who might never come home. For every bomb that fell, a child lost a dream, a family lost its world, and a nation lost its future. Yet, even as they fought, the two powers knew that their rivalry could never truly erase the other. Their fates were intertwined, like two sides of a coin spinning endlessly in a game neither could win. Elsewhere, new alliances rose from the ashes of the old. Turkey, once a bridge between East and West, sought to reclaim a position of influence. Its ambition stretched from the Mediterranean to the depths of Africa, but its path was fraught with challenges. Russia, a distant yet formidable player, cast its shadow over the region, offering arms and influence to nations willing to align with its agenda. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, brought promises of economic investment but also stirred fears of dependency. And the United States, long a dominant power in the region, found its role questioned. Once seen as the arbiter of Middle Eastern affairs, its influence seemed to wane, leaving behind allies who questioned its commitment and adversaries emboldened by its hesitations. Nations like Israel, which had depended on unwavering support, now found themselves forging unlikely partnerships. In the halls of power, whispers of alliances between Israel and Gulf states signaled a shift few had dared to imagine, but these alliances came with risks, as the Palestinian cause remained a wound yet to heal. Even as these alliances shifted and rivalries burned, the Middle East stood at the center of a globalized economy. Oil, the lifeblood of the region, continued to flow, but its dominance was no longer assured. The world was changing, turning toward renewable energy and new technologies. In the towering boardrooms of Riyadh and the shimmering offices of Doha, leaders grappled with a question that could not be ignored: what would the Middle East be without oil? Visionaries dreamed of futures unshackled from the past. Saudi Arabia unveiled plans for a futuristic city in the desert, a testament to its hopes of diversifying its economy. The UAE built dazzling hubs of tourism and technology, transforming itself into a global destination. Yet, for all the ambition, the shadows of inequality persisted. Wealth flowed in rivers for some, while others were left struggling to scrape by. In the margins of these great transformations, the poor, the displaced, and the forgotten watched as promises of prosperity seemed to pass them by. The scars of colonialism and intervention had left their mark, and the region's place in geopolitics carried the weight of these histories. Western nations, once the architects of borders and destinies, continued to assert influence, often under the guise of diplomacy or economic aid. For every agreement signed, there were strings attached, strings that tied the region's future to decisions made far beyond its shores. Yet, the people of the Middle East refused to be defined by these powers. They were resilient, resourceful, and unyielding in their fight for dignity and autonomy. In the face of intervention, they sought to reclaim their narratives. In the face of division, they fought for unity. In the face of an uncertain future, they held on to hope. There were moments of triumph, glimpses of what the region could become. Young entrepreneurs in Beirut, Cairo, and Amman built startups that bridged cultures, proving that innovation could thrive even in adversity. Artists and writers captured the essence of a land that had seen so much yet endured with grace. Activists and leaders emerged, challenging the status quo, demanding accountability, and reminding the world that the Middle East was not just a place of conflict, but a place of potential. As the sun set over the vast deserts and bustling cities, the Middle East stood at a crossroads. Its future was uncertain, shaped by forces both within and beyond its control. But one thing was clear: the spirit of its people, forged in the fires of history, would not be broken. They carried with them the dreams of generations, the hopes of a land that had given the world so much and still had so much to give. The winds of change swept across the region, carrying with them the promise of a new dawn.